Hi everyone, welcome to the brief overview of culturally responsive teaching. So first of all, we need to start out by just clarifying what culture is. I know sometimes this is assumed, but oftentimes it becomes interchangeable with just race or ethnicity, and it is much more than that. So if you go to look up the definition of culture, see if it pops up here, what we're looking at is, first of all, general definition, the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. Okay, so it can involve race, but it can also involve religion or any other social group. The set of shared values, attitudes, goals, and practices that characterizes an institution or organization. So even just simply belonging to a group or organization that can kind of set up its own set of cultural practices, and the set of values, conventions, or social practices associated with a particular field, activity, or societal characteristics. And so it's much broader than we often usually consider. That means when we talk about culturally responsive teaching, it can be related to race and ethnicity, also linguistic background. It can be related to SES, so social class, gender identity, family systems and structure, geographic regions, whether you're growing up in an urban, suburban, or rural environment, ability status from whatever generation you are from, age, that creates its own set of culture, and religion. And this is not an exhaustive list. And so we have to think really holistically about it and what this means for our students. But how did we get here in realizing that culture is so central to the teaching and learning process? Well, we realized that after we continued decade after decade applying these really historically rooted and in some ways valuable learning theories and realizing there were some limitations. And so really the broad learning theories that really drive instruction in schools are the ones we've talked about: behaviorism, Piaget's theory of cognitive development, which overlaps with the perspective of constructivism, and then there's Vygotsky's sociocultural theory that aligns with social constructivism. And over the weeks, we've realized that yes, each one has some merits and each one has some limitations. And so just going over some of the, if we look at the pros and cons of these different approaches, this image shows it's kind of much more teacher-centered, right? So that's one downside is, in fact, that we are shifting power to the teacher, which in some circumstances can be helpful. We know that it's not always the best approach. We also know there's a continued need of reinforcers when you're using operant conditioning. Most importantly, it really views students as passive. It ignores individual strengths and needs. We know some of these approaches can re-traumatize students. We also know it ignores cultural background and experiences. It assumes the teacher and adults hold the knowledge and skills. Learning can sometimes be superficial. And what about relationships? You've talked about that in almost every single set of discussion boards. For Piaget's theory, he was a stage-based theorist, believed it was a very linear process, and we know working with children, that's not exactly how it works, and we can see a very wide range of abilities and interests at any age. They have found that his theory might underestimate or overestimate abilities. Also, there's the assertion that cognitive development is guided by development rather than really that intersection of developmental processes and environment. Again, it completely ignores culture and language and really doesn't discuss relationships either. For Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, the zone of proximal development is somewhat vague. It doesn't explain motivation or other factors for moving forward. Considers culture in a really narrow way, not as a mediating tool for instruction. It ignores larger intersecting context of development like laws, media, community, family, which we'll talk about during the Ecological Systems Model Week. It emphasizes the role of the teacher, de-emphasizes the agency of the child. It assumes social interactions and collaboration are positive and enriching, which we've also all reported on. It doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And again, really doesn't get at this idea of relationships. And we know, research tells us time and again that teacher-student relationship is really key to seeing positive outcomes for kids. So, what is missing from these theories? A discussion about strong positive relationships with students and why that matters, why the relationship between the adult or the teacher and the child can make a difference on the learning process, and also centering culture. And so culturally responsive teaching then was identified as and kind of created as almost this little t theory. So instead of these big, broad, big T theories, the little t theories helps us really kind of recenter some of the principles and almost in some ways supplements the theories that we've looked at. And so The state of Illinois was one of the first states to really move forward on this and really thinking about, okay, we need to make sure teachers who are training to become teachers and teachers in the field understand culturally responsive teaching. And I know this is an area that most of you reported feeling the most well versed in. And so hopefully this is just kind of reactivating some of the learning that you've done over the years. But they broke it up into a number of standards, from self-awareness in relationship to others, systems of oppression, students as individuals, students as co-creators, leveraging student advocacy, family and community collaboration, content selections in all curricula, and student representation in the learning environment. I just briefly want us to take a look at this list. I know that this was part of your readings for this week, so you've gone over it, but I just want to talk about, I'll share some ways I have failed and succeeded at these over the years. And so, you know, in self-awareness in relationship to others, the idea is that we're unpacking our stuff and really reflecting to understand kind of who we are in our background is going to impact, you know, how we approach teaching, and it relates to academic and social emotional development for all students and kind of how we intersect with our students. So like number one, you know, it says, understand and value the notion that multiple lived experiences exist, that there is often not one correct way of doing or understanding something, and that what is seen as correct is most often based on our lived experiences. So one activity I used to do with my students is, it was a writing assignment because they had to meet some standards related to writing, but the topic was, how do you treat a cold? Okay. And this was such a fascinating assignment because I didn't have any two kids approach this in the same way. And there were so many ideas and so many strategies, and they kind of did a step-by-step process, from needing to change your sheets every night to having special teas that were made, going to the doctor or taking certain medications, or that you weren't supposed to go outside. So, but there wasn't a right way, right? They just needed to demonstrate writing skills, but they could do it in a variety of ways with, you know, by showing their background knowledge and experiences. And all of those then could be validated. And it was a great process for the whole class and learning from others. Another one, number 5, engage in self-reflection about their own actions and interactions and what ideas and biases motivated those actions. One memory I have of this is completely failing as a teacher, and how I used to use the word choice a lot with students. And I would say things, oh, you're not going to join our circle right now? Okay, so what is this choice here? Okay, are you gonna choose to be part of the group, or are you going to choose to sit at your table? What is your choice? And I remember one of my colleagues, and usually it would end with like the student not joining the group, or, you know, kind of getting frustrated with me. And what one of my colleagues pointed out to me is, she said, why are you saying, what are you choosing? Like, what is your choice? And I'm like, yeah, but we know there's like a right choice and a wrong choice. She's like, that sounds like some very middle class language to me. And what I didn't realize is I was using choice in a way that I grew up with, the way that my parents used it to me. Like, are you choosing to do this or this? But this is the right choice. And not in every, you know, in every household, that's not how it's used. And so I was setting some kids up for a disadvantage. And so that was kind of a bias in my language use in the classroom. Educate themselves about students' communities, cultures, and histories. I had a very large Muslim population at my school, and it took me probably about 3 months in to realize that we were planning kind of all our family activities on Fridays, which is the day of worship in Islam. So we had failed at that one, right? And really thinking about how are we understanding the culturals and the practices of families, and making sure that we are not putting some families at a disadvantage or making it more difficult for them in having to make a choice. So those are some ways that they can come out in the classroom. But then thinking about theoretically, why does this matter? Again, this is a theories class, and I love theories. So why does this matter? Let's think about systems of oppression, that second standard. Culturally responsive teachers and leaders understand that there are systems in our society, especially but not limited to our school system, that create and reinforce inequities, thereby creating oppressive conditions. This is kind of some really kind of deep wording, and it's hard to think about what does that look like in everyday life. And so theoretically, how does this standard help explain and predict a student's outcomes in school? Thinking about that, right? how do we create and reinforce inequities, right? Inequities means something is unfair, right? Something's disjointed in a way that it's going to end up privileging certain groups. Um, and it's going to create some obstacles for other groups. And so theoretically, if we have systems of oppression that we continue to support, we are going to keep that division and potentially even widen it, right? And that's why we're seeing different outcomes. So theoretically, that explains why we see those differences. So what does this look like then, that how this plays out in everyday life? Well, this was a great book I just read with my daughter the other day, Amira's Picture Day, if you haven't read it. But this gets at an idea of systems of oppression, and that like our academic calendar is structured around Christian holidays. So for this child who needed to go to the mosque to celebrate Ramadan, she had to miss, or potentially had to miss, the school's picture day, right? And if you think about that, that would never happen, right? On Christmas or Easter, or any other holiday, connected to Christianity, right? Because again, the system is structured around that. And so that would be one example of how we structure our calendar. Another example would be who has access to the arts, right? Oftentimes the arts become a privilege rather than a right, and who can afford the materials and being part of it, and other fees associated with it. So thinking about how can we make sure all children have access. Thinking about access to food, right? And that how we have food deserts. We have a lot of food insecurity, right? That unless we're actually addressing some of the structures that contribute to it, it will continue to impact students' lives. And we know that, not having access to healthy food and regular food is going to impact our executive function skills, right? And then you won't perform as well in school. Another example is Wi-Fi, right? With socioeconomic status, we can't assume that every child has regular, ongoing access to Wi-Fi. So what are we assigning? Are we expecting that students have this to be able to complete assignments or to engage in learning in some way? So we really have to be thoughtful about that. And so those are some examples of how that might play out in schools and in early childhood settings. Another example would be, so this is standard G4, and I think this one's about student representation. Ensure classroom and building decorations are inclusive of all students throughout the building or within the community or city at large. So again, this is the standard, but what does this mean theoretically for students? So theoretically, how could these standards explain or predict a student's success in school? So if a student visually sees themselves represented in the school setting or community setting, it could make them feel a sense of belonging or that they are valued enough to be shown. Therefore, they are more likely to feel at home and less of an outsider, which could increase their motivation and ability to do well academically and support their emotional and social well-being. And so whether that be, we were doing Women's History Month, well, that's great that you have women up there, but is there a diverse range of women, or is it all white women, right? That would make a difference for a child. When you're representing families, are you representing different family structures? I know my family is multiracial. We don't often get represented, right? So is everyone included? For my daughter's classroom, the teacher just has students bring in pictures of their family, right? So that they can see that representation. And then even just language and how we incorporate that in schools as well. Is this a culturally responsive teaching example? This is my daughter who they were learning how to count and do tally marks. So they were doing eye color. But my daughter was the only child of color, so the teachers gave her, the brown paper to represent her skin, although it didn't quite match. And they didn't have a different color of brown, so she had to use black round dots for her eyes, right? This is not culturally responsive teaching, right? Because you don't have the materials and the tools for a child to adequately represent themselves and feel included. Also bringing gaming into the classroom is huge. If you think about the age, the generation that now is coming up, it's a big part of who children are in the digital world, and gaming is a big piece of that. So even learning to read text, like thinking about games as a form of text that student can read. I also included a resource about kid watching and how you can spend time just walking around your classroom to really observe, look at the strengths of students, and this is a culturally responsive practice, to force yourself to be, I'm not going to be afraid and scared about what they're not doing, but I want to see what they are doing and unpack my cultural cues of how I'm viewing that to guide my instruction. So that is on our optional materials as well. And remember, it's never a choice, this or that. We teach all skills through culturally responsive teaching. Thank you.